They poured concrete, building a $30 million resort of luxury cabins and a marina right on top of my family ranch. For 18 long months, I just stood from afar and quietly watched, never filing a single complaint, nor saying a single word to stop them. My attorney had given me only one piece of advice. Stop them now, and you only get your empty land back. Wait until the day they prepare to hand over the keys, and you will get everything. And so I waited patiently. On the exact day of their grand opening, while champagne was being poured and investors were preparing to sign contracts, I walked in with a single folder of original deeds from 1968. In less than an hour, not only did that entire multi-million-dollar development rightfully belong to me, but I used the exact letter of the law to seize the very HOA clubhouse building where they used to bully me. They thought I was just a crazy old farmer who was easy to push around. But they forgot one basic rule. The land does not belong to the one with the loudest voice. It belongs to the person who holds the original paper. The evergreen valleys of Western Oregon share a single, absolute law with the rugged Sonoran Desert. They do not tolerate those who mistake temporary presence for permanent dominion. In these ancient places, the soil, the deep-running water tables, and the towering pine forests have seen 1,000 ambitious empires rise and crumble back into dust. The land is patient. It has been here for millennia, and it can afford to wait. But human arrogance is always in a hurry, always driven by the illusion that confidence and contracts can rewrite the shape of the earth. Arthur Pendleton was a man who understood the profound language of patience. At 62 years of age, he possessed the rugged, weather-beaten look of someone who had spent his entire life working outdoors under the shifting skies. He was a retired federal compliance inspector and a veteran military land surveyor, two highly specialized careers that had trained him to look at the world not through impressions, emotions, or social status, but through the precise cold lens of measurements, original deeds, and structural tolerances. After a lifetime of analyzing complex logistics, mapping international borders under extreme conditions, and auditing high-value government projects, he wanted nothing more than a quiet, unremarkable retirement. He found that retirement in the pristine Whispering Pines Valley of Oregon, on a sprawling, magnificent stretch of 1,500 acres of private land. This property had been in his family since 1968, legally deed-recorded, and passed down from his grandfather, Thomas Pendleton, who had cleared the first pasture trails by hand with a single team of horses. At the heart of Arthur's land lay a spectacular, spring-fed natural lake known in the historical county maps as Pendleton Lake. It was a sanctuary of deep, still water that reflected the towering ponderosa pines and the misty, low-hanging Oregon clouds. Arthur lived in a modest timber frame house near the shoreline, tending a small orchard of organic apple trees, keeping a few older quarter horses, and maintaining a historic wooden barn that his father had reinforced in the early 1970s. Arthur's daily routine was simple, governed by the predictable rhythms of the seasons. He woke before sunrise, out of a military habit that had never quite left him, made a single cup of strong black coffee, and walked his boundary lines. He checked the fences, watched the herons fish in the shallows, and noted the movement of the local wildlife. To the casual observer driving down the county road, Arthur was just a quiet, unassuming old-timer in a faded denim jacket and scuffed work boots, driving a rusted Ford F-150. Nobody in the county guessed that this silent retiree was highly trained in geospatial analysis and forensic accounting. And absolutely no one knew that inside the heavy steel safe, bolted to the floor of his study, lay an unimpeachable paper trail dating back over half a century. But the quiet of the valley was about to collide with the massive forces of modern development. 10 years earlier, a major real estate investment consortium had purchased the adjacent tract of land to the south and developed Whispering Pines Estates, a gated, ultra-exclusive enclave designed for the state's wealthiest residents. The development was a marvel of luxurious landscaping, featuring manicured golf courses, paved private lanes, and architectural guidelines that enforced an absolute sterile uniformity. At the head of this pristine empire sat Penelope Vance, the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Penelope was a 54-year-old former commercial real estate broker who had built her entire identity around control polish and the firm belief that money could solve any disagreement. She managed the HOA like a sovereign queen, using a 90-page handbook of rules to dictate everything from the acceptable shade of beige for garage doors to the exact date holiday decorations had to be taken down. Penelope believed that her authority was absolute, and she had never once been successfully challenged by her residents. To her, Arthur's unmanicured farm, with its tall native grasses, free-roaming horses, and weathered red wooden barn, was an eyesore. It was an intolerable insult to the visual perfection of her gated community, and she had decided that it was only a matter of time before she forced the old-timer off his land. She had no idea that she was walking directly into a trap that had been prepared decades before she ever set foot in Oregon. Behind the visual perfection of Whispering Pines Estates, there was an undercurrent of fear. The residents of this gated community, over 250 families, had grown accustomed to living under Penelope's authoritarian rule. They paid an annual HOA fee of up to $4,200, plus a series of bizarre surcharges for common area beautification and neighborhood security maintenance, without ever receiving a clear financial statement. Penelope often confidently declared in closed board meetings that she did not need to explain the cash flow in detail because the community's prosperity was the clearest proof of her effective management. To keep the valley aligned with her singular vision, she had signed an exclusive towing contract with Summit Recovery Services, ready to tow any vehicle that drifted even a few inches over the sidewalk boundary. Penelope believed that by applying iron discipline with no exceptions, she was protecting property values for everyone. In reality, she was building a personal fiefdom on the compliance and silence of the residents. They feared the red-stamped violation notices, the escalating fines that ballooned from a few hundred to tens of thousands of dollars, and above all, they feared confronting a legal system that Penelope bent entirely to her own whims. Arthur Pendleton had watched this entire development unfold from his timber frame porch. He saw the valley boundaries reshaped by concrete and artificial lawns, devouring thousands of gallons of water daily right next to his family's mature pines. Arthur did not oppose development. He understood that the world changes. But as a retired federal compliance auditor, he noticed irregularities from the moment groundbreaking began. He knew that a board too confident in its own power, operating without independent oversight, would inevitably dig its own legal grave. He began documenting everything, saving HOA newsletters, county zoning changes, and preserving his grandfather's original 1968 deed in the family safe. He did not seek conflict, but he was a soldier trained to prepare for the worst. The first true skirmish of the boundary war began on a cool Tuesday morning in early spring. Arthur was in his orchard inspecting the young apple trees when the low diesel rumble of a heavy vehicle vibrated through his boots. He walked down the gravel driveway and found a flatbed tow truck from Summit Recovery Services parked in his yard. Standing near the rear bumper of his rusted Ford F-150 was Penelope Vance, clipboard in hand, instructing the young tow operator to hook the chains. Arthur did not run. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked at his usual unhurried pace and stood 10 feet away. "Can I help you, Miss Vance?" he asked calmly. Penelope turned to him, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, her voice carrying the practiced, breezy confidence of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. "We are conducting our spring neighborhood compliance sweep. Your truck and that old tractor parked near your barn are in direct violation of Section 7 of our community standards regarding unauthorized agricultural and commercial vehicles. I have authorized Summit Recovery to impound them immediately. The towing and storage fees will be billed to your property." Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee. "There is a minor clerical error in your plan, Ms. Vance," he said quietly. "First, my property sits entirely outside the boundaries of Whispering Pines Estates. I am not a member of your association, and your standards carry exactly zero authority here. Second, you and your tow truck are currently trespassing on private land. I need you to order your driver to unhook my truck and leave my property immediately." Penelope let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Mr. Pendleton, the association's aesthetic corridor covers this entire valley regardless of individual deed status. Our legal team has reviewed the regional guidelines. If you refuse to comply, we will levy daily fines, place a lien on your property, and proceed with foreclosure." I have an entire board and a multi-million-dollar budget behind me. I suggest you sign this compliance notice and let the driver do his job." The tow operator, a young man named Ryan Brooks, looked visibly uncomfortable as he prepared to hook the chains to Arthur's bumper. He glanced at the truck's registration, then at Arthur's calm, steady eyes. Ryan hesitated, pulled out his phone and dialed his office. After a rapid, hushed conversation with his dispatch manager, Ryan's expression went completely blank. He unhooked the chains, stepped back, and stood with his hands flat at his sides. Within 5 minutes, a sleek black sedan of the Summit Recovery Executive Team pulled into the driveway. The regional operations manager, Marcus, climbed out, his face pale with panic. He walked straight past Penelope, approached Arthur, and extended his hand with deep respect. "Mr. Pendleton, I am incredibly sorry for this. The dispatch was automated through the HOA portal. We are leaving immediately." Penelope's face flushed with anger. "What is the meaning of this, Marcus? Your company holds an exclusive towing contract with my HOA. I am ordering you to tow these vehicles." Marcus turned to her, his voice cold. "Ms. Vance, you might want to review the corporate structure of your vendors. Summit Recovery is a subsidiary of Summit Holdings LLC, and the man you are currently trying to harass on his own property, Mr. Arthur Pendleton, is the founder and sole owner of Summit Holdings. He literally owns the company, the trucks, and the contract your HOA signed. You just ordered our driver to steal our owner's vehicle from his private land. We are terminating our contract with your HOA effective immediately due to unlawful dispatch directives." Penelope stood frozen as the tow truck and the black sedan backed out of the gate. Arthur took another sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. "Have a pleasant afternoon, Miss Vance," he said softly. But Penelope was blinded by her own pride. As she climbed back into her Range Rover, she stared at Arthur. "You think you are clever, Pendleton," she spat, "but I will find a way to make this valley too expensive for you to keep." Arthur did not answer. He watched her speed away, then walked back to his study, opened his filing cabinet, and logged the date, time, and Marcus's contact info into his evidence file. The documentation was beginning to grow, and Arthur was a very patient man. Penelope's failed towing attempt quickly became the talk of Whispering Pines Estates. The residents began to look at Arthur Pendleton through a different lens, no longer as an eccentric, rugged old-timer living in isolation by the lake, but as a formidable adversary who owned the very logistics and towing giant with which the HOA had contracted. A few veteran residents began walking past Arthur's gate in the late afternoons, pretending to stroll, just to share their grievances under Penelope's rule. Gerald Marsh, a retired accountant, stopped near Arthur's fence and said, "Arthur, did you know my wrongful fine bill has reached $6,000 just because I planted lavender near the common path? I asked the board for the written rules, but they refused and threatened to place a lien on my house if I don't pay within 10 days. Arthur listened in silence, poured Gerald a glass of fresh apple cider from his orchard, and said, "Gerald, keep all those emails and fine notices. Don't argue with words. Let the paperwork do the work." Arthur's silence and patience were not submission. They were the meticulous preparation of a systems engineer measuring every crack in his opponent's structure. He knew Penelope Vance was blinded by illusory power and arrogance. She had never known defeat, which made her believe she was invincible. When an adversary believes they cannot be beaten, they begin to act recklessly, skipping basic legal checks and diving headfirst into irreparable violations. Arthur only needed to keep his boundaries clean, his documentation precise, and wait patiently for his opponent to step into the trap they had built for themselves. Frustrated by the towing disaster, Penelope decided to strike back with a bolder legal maneuver. She spent the next 2 weeks searching county codes until she found a 40-year-old zoning setback ordinance. On a Thursday morning, she returned to Arthur's gate, accompanied by 3 sharply dressed attorneys and an excavator idling on a flatbed trailer. She dropped a thick folder of papers onto Arthur's porch steps. "You have exactly 24 hours to demolish that wooden barn," Penelope announced loudly, ensuring the neighbors gathering near the road could hear. "Our surveys indicate it violates the setback boundary by standing too close to the HOA's common land. If it is not gone by tomorrow afternoon, our contractors will demolish it at your expense, and we will file a $75,000 non-compliance lien against your home." Arthur picked up the folder. He did not argue. He did not look at the excavator. He simply looked at Penelope, smiled, and said, "Okay." Penelope marched back to her car, convinced she had finally broken his stubborn spirit. But Arthur was already calling his land use attorney, Daniel Price. They met at the county recorder's office and spent 4 hours digging through the original 1983 plat maps and the regional deed registry going back to the 1970s. What they uncovered was a clerical and contractual error so staggering that Daniel Price set his glasses down, rubbed his temple, and laughed quietly for several minutes. "Arthur," Daniel said, pointing to a dusty, bound lease ledger from 1974. "The HOA clubhouse, the $2 million building where Penelope hosts her board meetings, manages her compliance files, and stores the association's physical assets, does not actually belong to the HOA. The land beneath it was leased on a 99-year agreement from a local farmer named Howard Blake. The lease has an airtight clause in the event of any change of land ownership. The new landlord has the unilateral right to renegotiate the rental rate to market value immediately with absolutely no cap." "And where is Howard Blake now?" Arthur asked. "He's 65, retired in Florida, and he's been furious with Penelope for years because she's been delaying his modest lease payments and treating him like an administrative nuisance," Daniel replied. "I'll call his attorney right now." At noon the next day, Penelope stood outside Arthur's gate, flanked by her lawyers and a crowd of curious residents with their phones raised to record the demolition. Arthur stepped onto his porch, accompanied by Daniel Price, who carried a single manila folder. "Miss Vance," Daniel Price announced, his voice carrying clearly over the rumble of the excavator, "before you order your driver to touch that barn, I suggest your legal team review these certified county documents." He handed a packet to Penelope's lead attorney, Preston Wade. Preston opened it with a smirk, but as he read the first page, his smile vanished. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his face turning pale. He leaned over and whispered in a frantic undertone to Penelope. "What is it, Preston?" Penelope demanded, her voice climbing. "Tear the barn down." Preston Wade shook his head. "Miss Vance, we have to stop. The zoning setback code you cited only applies to interior residential lots within our plat. Mr. Pendleton's property is a grandfathered agricultural estate which is legally exempt from subdivision setbacks. But more importantly, look at the second document." Penelope snatched the paper. It was a certified deed of sale stamped by the county recorder's office just 3 hours earlier. "Howard Blake sold the land beneath our clubhouse to Arthur Pendleton's investment trust yesterday," Preston Wade whispered. "Mr. Pendleton is now our landlord, and this attached notice is a formal rent adjustment. Starting tomorrow morning, our clubhouse rent is increasing tenfold from $500 a month to $5,000 a month. If the HOA fails to pay, we have 10 days to vacate the building and forfeit all improvements." The silence that settled over the crowd was absolute. Arthur stood on his porch holding his coffee. "You gave me 24 hours to leave my barn, Penelope," he said quietly. "So I used those 24 hours to buy your clubhouse. I believe your excavator is blocking my driveway. Please move it." The clubhouse coup dealt a fatal blow to Penelope Vance's credibility within the HOA board. Other board members began asking uncomfortable questions in closed sessions. Why was a $2 million clubhouse constructed on leased land without anyone on the current board knowing the terms? Where had the accumulated maintenance reserves gone over the last 10 years now that Arthur's lease bill had skyrocketed to $50,000 a month, forcing an emergency draw to avoid eviction within 10 days? Penelope desperately tried to defend herself, blaming previous board members for negligence and promising that Crescent Bay's legal team would find a loophole to invalidate Arthur's lease. But Preston Wade, her attorney, knew the 1974 lease agreement was completely legal and airtight against any administrative arguments. Arthur Pendleton was the lawful owner of the land beneath the clubhouse, and raising the rent tenfold was fully justified under the ownership transfer clause signed between Howard Blake and the original developer. Financial strain began to weigh heavily on every resident of Whispering Pines Estates. To fund the massive monthly lease payment to Arthur Pendleton, was forced to pass a special assessment demanding an immediate $2,000 from every household. Outrage erupted across the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once silently complied began gathering to protest outside the clubhouse. They realized that Penelope's arrogance and bullying of the rugged old-timer was now directly draining their wallets every single day. Yet Penelope stubbornly believed she could turn the tide with the Crescent Bay Lakeside Retreat project. She needed the $30 million revenue from this development to cover the budget deficits and reclaim her supreme position in the valley. Following the humiliating clubhouse takeover, Penelope Vance went completely silent. She refused to speak to her board, refused to answer emails from residents, and refused to address the rumors spreading through the neighborhood. But behind closed doors, she was planning a high-stakes financial gamble that she believed would settle the war once and for all. Whispering Pines Estates was backed by a massive regional investment consortium. Penelope's husband was a major partner in Crescent Bay Land Holdings. Together, they devised a project called Crescent Bay Lakeside Retreat, a luxury development comprising 50 high-end timber cabins and a state-of-the-art private marina with a total projected sales value of $30 million. To maximize the value of the cabins, they needed premium lake frontage. The problem was that the eastern shoreline of the lake belonged to Arthur Pendleton. Penelope, relying on an outdated digital GIS survey that had been compiled carelessly by the county in the mid-1990s, convinced her board and her investors that a 400-foot strip of Arthur's shoreline was actually a community recreational easement belonging to the HOA. She did not conduct an independent physical survey. She did not seek Arthur's permission. She simply hired an aggressive surveying firm, Apex Boundary Services, to redraw the plat lines digitally and sent construction crews to break ground. One afternoon, Arthur walked down to his shoreline and found bulldozers tearing up the native grasses where the blue herons nested. Heavy machinery was grading the soil, and construction workers were driving concrete pilings deep into the lakebed to build a massive dock structure. He walked up to the construction manager, a man named David, and asked to see their permits. David produced a document signed by Penelope Vance, citing the modified digital plat of the HOA. Arthur called Daniel Price immediately. "Daniel?" he said, watching the machines reshape his family's land. "They are pouring concrete on my shoreline. They are clearing the trees my father planted. We need to file an immediate injunction." Daniel Price was silent on the other end of the line for a long moment. Arthur could hear the rustle of paper as his attorney reviewed the files. "Arthur," Daniel said, his voice carrying the slow, deliberate weight of a seasoned litigator. "We can file for an injunction today. The judge will grant it, the county will order them to stop, they will pack up their bulldozers, and you will get your land back. But Crescent Bay will only lose a few $1,000s in mobilization costs. They will rewrite their plans, adjust their boundaries, and build their $30 million project just 50 feet back, completely out of our reach." "What are you suggesting?" Arthur asked. "I am suggesting we play the long game," Daniel said. "Under Oregon property law, if a party knowingly encroaches on a clearly defined deed-recorded property and constructs permanent improvements without the owner's written consent, those improvements belong entirely to the landowner once title is quieted. If we wait, if we let them spend their $30 million, if we let them build those 50 luxury cabins, pave those roads, and install that marina, then on the day of their grand opening, we file a lis pendens on every single cabin. We freeze every transaction. We walk into court with your unimpeachable 1968 deed and your grandfather's physical survey markers. And we don't just get your land back. We get the $30 million of improvements they built on it. Can you watch them build on your land for 18 months without saying a word?" Arthur looked at the lake. He thought of his grandfather who had spent his retirement walking these pastures. He thought of his late wife who had loved the quiet of the shoreline. And he felt a cold, immovable certainty settle in his chest. "Yes," Arthur said, "I can wait." For the next 18 months, Arthur Pendleton became a silent observer of his own land's occupation. Every single week, he walked the boundary lines carrying a high-resolution digital camera with a GPS chip that embedded precise coordinates and timestamps into every image file. He documented every concrete truck, every timber frame, and every pile driven into his lakebed. His paralegal team formatted these reports into a massive structured evidence file that grew thicker with every passing month. Penelope and her board watched him from their golf carts, whispering about the old-timer who had apparently run out of fight. They believed his silence was surrender. They did not know that every nail they drove, every stone they laid, and every dollar they spent was a brick in the wall of their own destruction. For 18 long months, the Crescent Bay Lakeside Retreat project took shape along Arthur's eastern shoreline. 50 luxury cedar cabins were constructed, internal asphalt roads were smoothly paved, and the private marina, with its state-of-the-art floating docks, stood ready to welcome the million-dollar yachts of the elite. Penelope and her husband Marcus had poured all their financial resources into it, even mortgaging personal assets and drawing a $7 million bridge loan from the bank based on the boundary markers redrawn by Apex Boundary Services. Arthur Pendleton watched this entire process with astonishing composure. He saw the majestic ponderosa pines planted by his father cleared for cabin foundations, and concrete mixers continuously pouring foundations over the boundary line, legally recorded in his family's 1968 deed. Sometimes construction workers noticed the old-timer in his flannel shirt, standing quietly on the boundary line, taking photos with his digital camera of every foundation and move marker. They asked if he wanted to stop them, but Arthur simply shook his head mildly, wished them a good day, and continued logging GPS coordinates on his field laptop. Daniel Price, Arthur's attorney, closely monitored the construction progress through sequential field reports. In a meeting at his office, Daniel pointed to the evidence file now over 20 inches thick and said, "Arthur, they have finished installing the glass and roofing for the first 30 cabins. According to schedule, they will begin handing over keys to buyers on December 20th. This is the most critical window. Once they sign the transfer papers and receive funds from the title companies, the entire $30 million will be locked in escrow. That is when we strike our fatal blow. Every cabin built on your land will be locked down by a list pendants, transforming their entire project into an inescapable legal disaster." Arthur nodded and took a sip of hot ginger tea and said, "I've waited 18 months, Daniel. I can wait a few more weeks." By the summer of the second year, the Crescent Bay Lakeside Retreat was completed. It was a masterpiece of luxury hospitality. 50 timber cabins stood beautifully framed against the pine forest, their glass fronts reflecting the water. The private marina was lined with covered boat slips where residents had already parked their luxury yachts. The grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday in late August, an event that Penelope had spent 6 months organizing with the precision of a military campaign. But August brought a historic, unprecedented drought to Oregon. The water table dropped to record lows, and the State Water Resources Board issued an emergency shortage warning for the entire county. Under the Regional Water Code, the aquifer that fed the lake was a protected resource. The original well and pump station that maintained the lake's water level sat entirely on Arthur's grandfather's parcel. According to the 1968 deed and a valid, unexpired water rights certificate, Arthur held priority appropriation rights to the aquifer. Penelope's marina project had been designed with an environmental flaw. The marina and the floating cafe platform required the lake to maintain a constant depth of 12 feet to prevent the heavy, luxury yachts from grounding on the rocky lakebed. To achieve this during the drought, the HOA's maintenance team had quietly cut the padlock on Arthur's northern auxiliary valve house, installed their own lock, and adjusted the main intake to draw maximum water from Arthur's private springs to keep their marina full. They did not know that Arthur's security cameras captured every second of the trespass, including the faces of the maintenance crew and the written order signed by Penelope Vance, instructing them to secure the water source first, negotiate later. On the Thursday night before the grand opening, at exactly 2:41 a.m., Arthur drove his old truck along the narrow service road that wound deep into the forest behind his cabin. He carried his folder of certified water rights, a copy of the state emergency drought order, and a heavy padlock of his own. He unlocked the maintenance gate of the old pump station, a structure built by his father that remained structurally flawless. He did not touch the HOA's lock on his valve. Instead, he went to the master electrical control cabinet, which was wired entirely to his home's power grid. Arthur looked at his watch. 2:41 a.m. He reached out his hand, gripped the heavy iron breaker handle, and pulled it down with a sharp, resonant clack. The massive underground pumps, which had been running to siphon water into the HOA's development, went instantly silent. The power was cut, the intake valves closed. Under the terms of his 1952 prior appropriation water right and the State Drought Protection Act, Arthur had legally isolated his private aquifer to protect it from ecological collapse during a declared shortage. He locked the electrical cabinet with his new case-hardened padlock, taped on a laminated copy of the state emergency order to the door, and walked back to his truck. The results were immediate and devastating. Without the automated pump system maintaining the artificial level, the lake began to drain naturally through its southern outflow creek. By 5 a.m., a low, rolling roar of water moving through the rocks echoed through the valley. By sunrise, the prestigious Crescent Bay Marina had ceased to exist. Where several million gallons of clear still water had glittered under the pine trees, there was now nothing but a vast, cracked, sun-baked basin of gray mud. The $50 million marina sat tra-tra, its wooden pilings exposed like ribs. The luxury yachts, which had been tied neatly to their slips, were now stuck deep in the thick mud, tilting at absurd angles, their fiberglass hulls creaking under the strain. The floating cafe platform had collapsed onto a pile of wet rocks, its structure bent and ruined. By 7 a.m., the quiet lanes of Whispering Pines Estates were filled with the sound of slamming car doors and shouting voices. Hundreds of residents in their bathrobes and slippers poured out of their homes, staring in complete disbelief at the muddy wasteland where their lake had been. Penelope Vance arrived at the shoreline in her pajamas, her face pale, her carefully manicured hair disheveled. She stared at the stranded yachts and the collapsed cafe, her voice trembling with rage as she dialed her administrative assistant. "Who did this?" she screamed. "Find him! Call the sheriff. I want him arrested immediately." The draining of the lake on that moonless night turned Whispering Pines Valley into a literal battlefield as dawn broke. The lake bed lay bare, a vast expanse of cracked gray mud, emitting a heavy, sour stench of rotting vegetation and stranded fish baking under the August sun. The wealthy residents of Whispering Pines Estates, who had paid millions for an illusion of waterfront luxury, woke up to a harsh reality. Their expensive yachts sat tilted and stranded deep in the thick mud, unable to move even a single yard. Penelope Vance, standing before a crowd of panicked and furious residents, tried to maintain control by shifting all blame onto Arthur Pendleton. She screamed into her megaphone, "This is a deliberate, malicious act of sabotage. Mr. Pendleton has locked our valley's water supply without authorization. Our legal team and the county sheriff are on their way here to arrest him and force the pumps back online immediately." But when Sheriff Tom Goretti and the state hydraulic engineers appeared at the pump station, they brought no arrest warrant for Arthur. Instead, they spent 2 hours checking the valves, technical seals, and Arthur's master electrical panel. Dale Sutherland, the county's chief engineer, stood before Penelope and said in a flat civil servant's voice, "Ms. Vance, this pumping station sits entirely on private land owned by the Pendleton family and is under Mr. Pendleton's lawful ownership since 1968. Under the state's Emergency Drought Protection Act, Mr. Pendleton has every legal right to cut power to the system to protect his aquifer from ecological collapse due to unauthorized draw. Your HOA does not own a single gallon of water in this aquifer, and your crew's cutting of his padlock earlier was the actual criminal act." Dale Sutherland's confirmation was a death sentence for the Crescent Bay Lakeside Retreat Project. Penelope stared out at the cracked mud of the lake bed, realizing that her multi-million-dollar marina and waterfront amenities were nothing but expensive lumber on dry earth without Arthur's permission. Her arrogance shattered, exposing the sheer panic of someone who had gambled her entire fortune and reputation on a 10-year lie. By 10 a.m. on Saturday, the Welcome Center of Crescent Bay Lakeside Retreat was packed. More than 300 guests, investors, and local politicians had arrived for the grand opening ceremony. Champagne was supposed to be flowing, and a string quartet was scheduled to play near the glass pavilion. Instead, the atmosphere was thick with tension, confusion, and the sour, heavy smell of lake mud drifting through the vaulted timber windows. Penelope Vance stood near the reception desk, her face frozen into a mask of desperate composure. Her husband, Marcus, and her lead attorney, Preston Wade, were huddled in the corner speaking in rapid, hushed tones. The double doors of the Welcome Center splayed open. Arthur Pendleton walked in. He was wearing his faded flannel shirt, work boots, and canvas jacket, looking exactly like the simple rancher Penelope had mocked for 18 months. Beside him was Daniel Price, carrying a heavy leather document case, and two deputies from the county sheriff's department. Penelope's eyes narrowed. She marched across the room, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. "You!" she shrieked loud enough for the entire crowd of 300 guests to hear. "You sabotaged water. You destroyed our marina. Deputies, arrest this man. He is trespassing on our grand opening." Arthur did not raise his voice. He set his dented metal thermos of coffee on the reception desk, turned to Deputy Mason Reed, and said quietly, "Officer, would you please present the filings?" Daniel Price opened his leather case and withdrew a stack of 50 individual lis pendens filings, freshly stamped by the county clerk's office just 2 hours prior. He set them on the desk, followed by a certified copy of Arthur's 1968 deed and the original 1983 subdivision plat. "Miss Vance," Daniel Price announced, his voice steady, precise, and carrying to every corner of the silent room. "We are not here to negotiate, we are here to serve you. These are 50 individual lis pendens filings attached to every single cabin unit in the Crescent Bay development. A lis pendens is a legal notice of active litigation. It means these properties carry a contested title. As of 10 o'clock this morning, no title company in this state will issue an insurance policy on these cabins. No bank will fund a mortgage, and not a single sale can close." Penelope's face went pale. "On what grounds?" she stammered. "Our surveyors confirmed the boundary. Your surveyors used a digital zoning map, which does not override a recorded property deed," Daniel Price replied. He activated a portable digital projector, throwing a side-by-side comparison of the maps onto the vaulted timber wall behind the desk. "This is the original 1983 survey monument, which we uncovered buried 4 inches beneath the soil on your construction site," Daniel explained, showing a GPS-tagged photograph of the rusted iron pin. The entire Crescent Bay development, all 50 cabins, the paved access roads, and the marina itself was constructed 400 feet inside the legal property line of Mr. Arthur Pendleton. Under Oregon property law, these structures were built unlawfully on private land without the owner's consent. They do not belong to the HOA. They do not belong to your investors. They are legally classified as permanent improvements to Mr. Pendleton's estate. He is now the sole owner of all 50 cabins. A collective gasp moved through the room. Several major investors set their champagne glasses down their faces, completely draining of color. "This is a lie," Penelope screamed, turning to her husband. "Marcus, tell them it's a lie." Marcus Kane did not speak. He was staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open, realizing that his $30 million investment had just evaporated into Arthur's family forest. "But we are not finished." Daniel Price continued, pulling another document from his case. "This is the final report of an independent financial audit conducted on the HOA's accounts. We subpoenaed these records through our clubhouse lease litigation. It turns out, Ms. Vance, that you have been diverting association reserve funds, nearly $460,000, to pay for your private landscaping company, Crescent Bay Landscaping, and to fund your husband's development costs without ever disclosing these transactions to your board or your residents." Deputy Mason Reed stepped forward, a pair of handcuffs glinting in his hand. "Marlene Vance," he said, "I have a warrant for your arrest issued by the district attorney. The charges include wire fraud, falsification of public land records, and embezzlement of association funds." As the handcuffs clicked around Penelope's wrists, the silence in the Welcome Center was broken only by the rapid, frantic typing of reporters on their phones. Penelope looked at Arthur, her composure completely shattered. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Why didn't you stop us when we first broke ground? Why did you let us spend $30 million? Arthur picked up his thermos of coffee, looked her directly in the eyes, and said in the same unhurried, quiet voice he had used from the very beginning, "Some lessons cannot be taught through words, Penelope. You had to finish making your biggest mistake before you would finally listen." The grand reckoning at the Crescent Bay Welcome Center unfolded before more than 300 guests in luxury suits and elegant dresses. The applause celebrating Penelope Vance's achievement died instantly as the side-by-side comparison of the boundary maps was projected onto the vaulted cedar wall, exposing the HOA's deception to everyone in the room. Gerald Marsh, the resident who had been wrongfully fined $6,000 for his lavender, stood up in the middle row and shouted into the microphone, "Miss Vance, you told us this entire project was fully surveyed and completely legal. Why is it now proven that all 50 cabins are built on the Pendleton estate? Why was our maintenance reserve money funneled into your husband's personal accounts through sham landscaping contracts? We demand your immediate resignation and a full accounting before the state authorities dismantle this office." Extreme chaos erupted. Major investors from Atlanta and Nashville stood up in a panic, gathering their folders and calling their title insurance companies to halt all escrow transactions immediately. They understood that with 50 individual list pendants filed by Daniel Price Crescent Bay was now a frozen, worthless asset. They had poured tens of millions into a land fraud scheme operated by an abusive HOA president and a reckless developer. Penelope Vance looked at her husband Marcus, who was now slumping his head over the conference table, completely defeated in the face of the irrefutable financial evidence that the federal IRS agents had just served. The silver scissors meant for cutting the ribbon fell from her trembling hands, clattering on the polished tile floor. Penelope looked at Arthur Pendleton, who was still standing quietly beside his family's old steel safe, holding his scuffed coffee mug. She realized that Arthur's silence over the past 18 months was not weakness, but the brutal, cold patience of a soldier who had waited for his opponent to tighten the noose around her own neck. The fallout from that Saturday morning was systematic and complete. Penelope Vance was convicted of multiple state and federal counts of real estate fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. She received a 6-year sentence in a state facility, and her personal assets, including her luxury SUV and her home, were seized to pay restitution to the defrauded homeowners of Whispering Pines Estates. The old HOA board was dissolved in disgrace, replaced by an interim board led by Gerald Marsh, a retired accountant who immediately implemented strict public financial disclosure protocols. Arthur Pendleton did not use his victory to destroy the community. He was an engineer, and he understood that the families who had purchased contracts on those cabins had acted in good faith, misled by Penelope's confident lies. He worked with Daniel Price to draft a fair, quiet solution. He sold 30 of the 50 cabins back to the original families at a 15% discount from their original purchase price, ensuring they did not lose their life savings. He used the proceeds from those sales to fund the complete environmental restoration of the lake's shoreline, replanting the native grasses, and rebuilding the wetlands so the herons and painted turtles could return. The remaining 20 cabins were converted into the Whispering Pines Nature Reserve and Veterans Sanctuary, a quiet, protected retreat managed by a nonprofit trust where retired veterans and their families could stay at no charge to experience the peace of the Oregon Valley. A year after the grand opening disaster, the valley had settled back into its natural, quiet rhythm. The lake was full again, its waters still and wide, under the autumn sun reflecting the golden light of late September. Arthur sat on his porch, holding a warm cup of coffee, watching his horse Duke graze in the pasture. The new cedar fence line ran straight and solid along the corrected boundary, its posts driven deep and legal. The old wooden barn stood steady behind him, its red paint weather-beaten but intact, outlasting Penelope's tenure, outlasting the developers and outlasting the noise. Gerald Marsh, now the interim board chair, walked down the gravel road and stopped near the gate. He looked at the serene, undisturbed lake, then at Arthur. "Arthur?" he said quietly, holding a clipboard with the newly audited accounts of the community. "We are preparing the annual budget. We've allocated the funds for the clubhouse lease. I wanted to make sure everything was in order." Arthur smiled, nodding once. "It is, Gerald. Everything is exactly where it is supposed to be." Gerald nodded, thanked him, and walked back toward the subdivision, his steps unhurried and respectful. The valley was quiet again. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing, carrying the scent of cold earth and wet wood. Arthur finished his coffee, picked up his tools, and walked toward the barn. He had lived his life, kept his promises, and let the paper speak for itself. He had proven that real power does not need to shout, and that the quietest man standing on solid documented ground can never be moved. The peace of the Oregon Valley was restored not through violence or angry shouting, but by the quiet certainty of written deeds protected by a good man's patience. Arthur Pendleton never viewed his multi-million-dollar legal victory as a personal game of revenge. He understood that land is a permanent legacy and a true steward protects the harmony of the valley. His decision to sell 30 of the cabins back to the victim families at a 15% discount ensured they did not lose their life savings while turning them into his most loyal and trusted neighbors. The remaining 20 cabins were converted into a quiet nature sanctuary where veterans and their families could stay at no charge under the shade of the ponderosa pines. The following autumn, the Oregon Valley wore a warm coat of golden pine needles and blooming wildflowers. Arthur opened the intake valves to slowly refill the lake, and the water shimmered beautifully under the misty twilight. There was no more rumble of encroaching bulldozers, no more arbitrary fine notices from Penelope, and the old clubhouse now operated as a free community center open to all residents of the valley. Arthur sat on his timber-frame porch, stroking his sheepdog sleeping peacefully at his feet. He took a warm sip of coffee, looked out at the straight cedar fence line along the corrected boundary, and knew that the truth recorded in 1968 would outlast any arrogance, false authority, or greed. The valley would heal itself, requiring only a person patient enough to stand on the sacred boundary of what is right.